Good evening. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's public lecture. But before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to thank the founding director of the Institute, the Great Hunger Institute, Professor Christine Quinnipiac, for bringing us tonight's speaker, and also for the excellent work she's doing to develop the Institute. Our speaker tonight, Don Mullan, is a celebrated Irish author and humanitarian. Born in Derry, Northern Ireland, has been involved with human rights issues since his teenage years when he witnessed the Bloody Sunday massacre on 30th of January 1972. He was one of 500 citizens who gave eyewitness statements to the National Council of Civil Liberties in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday. 25 years later, those statements were to form the basis of Mullan's politically influential book, Eyewitness Bloody Sunday, The Truth. That is officially credited as a primary catalyst for British Prime Minister Tony Blair's decision to establish a new Bloody Sunday inquiry, and that also inspired the award-winning movie, Bloody Sunday, for which Mullan was co-producer, source writer, and actor. Mullan is the author or editor of several other best-selling books, including The Dublin and Monaghan Bombings, 1999, investigating the biggest unsolved political mass murder case in the history of the Republic of Ireland. And another important book is Speaking Truth to Power, exploring the mysterious retirement of a young officer from the Irish Defence Forces in 1969. In 2011, to commemorate the visit to Ireland of President Barack Obama, he edited and introduced the narrative of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, first published in Ireland in 1845. He's also co-founder with Christine Leary of the Frederick Douglass Daniel O'Connor Memorial Project. Mullan became director of Action from Ireland, an Irish justice, peace, and human rights NGO in 1979 at the age of 24, a position he held for 14 years. In 1994, he moved to Concern Worldwide, Ireland's highly respected international humanitarian organization, to help the organization commemorate the 150th anniversary of Ireland's Great Famine of 1845-1849. Mullan became friends with Archbishop Desmond Tutu in 1982, a friendship that remains intact. In 2009, he created the Desmond and Leah Tutu Peace Choir, and their plans are for to establish other peace choirs in the future. He's also supporting efforts to create the Desmond Tutu Peace Center in Cape Town. He's the recipient of numerous human rights awards and honorary degrees. In addition to the Frederick Douglass Daniel O'Connor Memorial Project, he's currently developing two other international projects: the Christmas Truce Project, the Flanders Peace Field, inspired by the 1914 Christmas Truce of World War I. And he's also developing the Pele Legacy Project, Goals for Life. Mullan is an avid football fan, or soccer as we call it here, and this is inspired by his friendship with the great Brazilian soccer legend, Pele. This evening I had the opportunity of listening to Mullan talk to the students about his experiences with Bloody Sunday. And what I was very impressed with is not only the ways he has turned his personal witness, his memory, but also his research prowess into commemorating this important event and using that as part and parcel of his activities with regards to human rights. Secondly, I was very impressed by the ways in which he shared with the students the interconnections between the struggles for civil rights in the United States and the struggles for civil rights in Ireland. And it is therefore with great pleasure that I would like to welcome Don Mullan to our university for what he's going to share with us tonight. Thank you.
Hello, my name is David Ives. I'm the Executive Director of the Albert Schweitzer Institute. We are pleased to be a co-sponsor of this event tonight. I've been here running the Schweitzer Institute since 2002. And personally, I've had a very strong interest in any issue related to hunger because of some of my experiences in the Peace Corps. I was a community gardens and nutrition promoter living in Central America about 30 years ago. And so when John got interested in, was talking about this Museum for the Great Hunger, it was something that was near and dear to my heart, and I'm especially pleased that this is the first cooperation that we've had with the Great Hunger Institute, and we hope we have many more to come. Indeed, we'll be working at the United Nations in the coming months, trying to develop programs and ideas so that we can work together on some very important projects that hopefully will make a difference in this world. The Schweitzer Institute promotes the values and ideas of Albert Schweitzer on a worldwide basis. We're quite involved with the Gorbachev Foundation Center for Summits of Nobel Peace Prize laureates. Indeed, we are going to go in about 2 or 3 weeks to the next summit of Nobel Peace Prize laureates in South Africa. You do a lot of work, and we will be celebrating the 20th anniversary of Nelson Mandela becoming president. And so those are the kinds of things that we have in common. As you were describing some of the things that you have done, we've also worked in Central America with Rigo Benjamin Chu and a number of other people who have done some very brave things. And so I think there's a perfect symbiosis and potential for cooperation. And I would also like to welcome you to our university, and hopefully we'll have a lot of things to talk about and work on in the future together. Thank you.
I need my glasses. Thank you, Paul and David. Thank you, everybody who is here tonight. A special thank you to the students, and thank you, President Leahy, who has come. Good evening, I'm Christine Keneally. I'm founding director of Ireland's Great Hunger Institute. We are just a year old, we're quite new. This event, as you've heard, is hosted by the Great Hunger Institute and by the Albert Schweitzer Institute. I'm very happy to introduce you to our guest, Don Mullan. I just have a few minutes to give you a sketch of his contribution to human rights throughout the world, not just in Ireland. Paul has told you some about Don's involvement in Bloody Sunday, so I just want to briefly reiterate. There was a peaceful civil rights march that was to take place in January 1972 to protest against internment. Thousands of local people turned out. Don Mullan, it was his first civil rights march. He was a 15-year-old schoolboy. At some point, the British paratroopers that had been sent to Derry a few days earlier were told they could fire live shots on the people of Derry. 14 people were killed, and for me, one of the most shocking statistics always is that of those 14 people, 6 of them were aged 17 years old. The British government followed up what happened on Bloody Sunday with what was called a whitewash. Essentially, the truth was not told. And as Paul has said, Don Mullan's book, Eyewitness Bloody Sunday, provided a catalyst for the Savile inquiry to sit and to reopen the running sore that was Bloody Sunday. What also is more remarkable about Don's contribution is that that day was a catalyst, because so many young men, angered by what they had seen on the streets of Derry, joined the IRA. Don chose a path of peace, which at the time was not an easy choice, and that has been his choice through life, to try and make a difference through dialogue and debate, not through violence. Paul has told you about what Don has been involved in, but maybe I could just explain a few other things that maybe don't make it onto Wikipedia or some of the more public sites of social media. I first met Don in 1995 when Don was working for Concern, and we worked together to educate people about hunger in the world today using the prism of Ireland's Great Hunger. Don and I both believe that famine is never simply about food shortages. Famine is about social justice. Some of his other campaigns, and there are many, include working to get, as we've heard, more recognition for Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave who went to Ireland in 1845, stayed there for 4 months, and described his time in Ireland as transformative. As he said, Until he went to Ireland, he felt like a chattel and not a man. So a very important period in his life. Don is working to bring the remains of Toussaint Louverture back from France to Haiti. Again, you may not know of Toussaint Louverture, but he led a revolution in Haiti in the 1790s and established the first black republic in the world. He was lured to France by Napoleon, and he was allowed to die in France, where his remains are to this day. Don has championed the cause of Melvina Dean, who was the last survivor on the Titanic. And when Don met her, she was living in poverty. And Don appealed to the filmmaker James Cameron and to the film stars Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet to help her financially, which they did eventually. Don doesn't give up easily. Don has also advocated on behalf of Cher Ami. Have any of you heard of Cher Ami, heroine of the First World War? Cher Ami, by her bravery, saved at least 200 lives during the First World War. Cher Ami, by the way, was a one-legged pigeon, and she carried messages between the Allies during the war. And despite being shot by German marksmen and being blinded and losing one of her legs, she carried on with the message and thus saved many lives by her actions. Currently, Don is working on a project to highlight the Christmas Truce of December 1914, which took place in Belgium during the so-called War to End All Wars. Don has described this watershed truce as a moment of humanity in a time of carnage. As part of this project, Don is creating the Flanders Peace Project. Don Mullan, my friend, my mentor, my inspiration, I'm very pleased to welcome you to Quinnipiac University.
Thank you very much, Christine. Christine and I are very good friends, and it's just a pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful. President John Leahy, thank you very much for the opportunity to visit, to Paul Zaliza for your lovely words, Dr. David Ives of the Schweitzer Institute. It was really very special, the hour we spent at the Institute, because I'm aware of Albert Schweitzer, but just to read some of the quotations, I just realized there's a soul there that I want to get to know more of. And of course to say thanks to Christine and Sarah Churchill for all your hard work as well in helping to organise this. And also I want to thank and welcome my co-founder of the Frederick Douglass Daniel O'Connell Project, Kristen Leary, who's travelled the whole way from Washington DC to be with Christine and myself tonight for this lecture. Paul mentioned that I've been friends with Desmond Tutu since 1982, and I've had the opportunity to hear him lecture on many occasions, and I noticed that there was a pattern. When he lectures, he begins with humour, he gives his message, and he ends with hope. And I thought, God, that's a good way. So I always begin with a little bit of humour, and the story is the Orange Man died, and he went to heaven. Do you know what an Orange Man is? He would be a member of an institute which would belong to the Protestant tradition, pro-British and so on, would want to maintain the union with the United Kingdom, would want to make sure that Ireland never is united. So anyway, an Orange Man died, and he went to heaven and knocked at the pearly gates, and St. Peter opened them. And he was about to walk in, and Peter says, no, hold on, I decide whether you get in here or not. And he said, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. And depending on your answer, your mortal soul and your mortal destiny depends. So he said, think carefully. So he said, the first question is, did you ever do anything spectacular in your life? And the Orange Man, quick as a flash, said, I did. Since I was a little boy, I took part in the Orange Parades on 12th of July every year. Big bands, buntings, bonfires, the sash my father wore. He says, they were pretty spectacular, and all the parades. So Peter said, look, I'm not overly impressed by this. So he said, I want you to think really carefully now about your next question. He said, did you ever do anything brave or heroic in your life? And again, quick as a flash, without even thinking, the Orange Man said, I did. I once walked down O'Connell Street in Dublin carrying the Union Jack. And St. Peter says, wow, he says, that was brave. He says, when did you do that? And the orange man looked at his watch and he said, about 2 minutes ago. So anyway, there were dark days when humour was important to take us through the troubles, and certainly Desmond Tutu, in terms of the darkness of apartheid, always maintained a great sense of humour, and humour is so important. Being at the Schweitzer Institute this afternoon confirmed me in the methodology I've decided to use for the lecture tonight. Because a lot of people wouldn't know who I am, and I think it's important just to understand some of the experiences that I've come through and how they shaped me and helped me to make decisions that led me in terms of the work that I have been doing all through my life and the work that I do today, including the commemoration of the Christmas Truce of 1914 and a smaller Christmas Truce of 1915. I mentioned tonight that there were a number of things that led me to embrace non-violence. First of all, again, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland was inspired by the black civil rights movement in the United States. One of our great heroes was Dr. Martin Luther King, the great Rosa Parks, and the slogans that we used and the songs that we sang, again, were influenced. You know, in an age of feminism, you'd never get away with it now, thank God, but the slogan, of course, was one man, one vote, which was taken directly from the civil rights movement here. And the anthem, which began and ended our civil rights demonstrations, was "We Shall Overcome." And it's interesting, when the last Bloody Sunday civil rights march took place, just after the announcement by Prime Minister Cameron, we marched to the Guildhall where it was supposed to be, and we actually ended by singing "We Shall Overcome," and it was very emotional. So I always feel a great sense of gratitude to the African American community in the United States, because they were a great inspiration for the Northern Ireland civil rights movement. A Bloody Sunday, of course, which I talked about just a half an hour ago to students at Quinnipiac who are studying it, was a huge influence in terms of who I am and what I became. I was a 15-year-old witness. It was a horrendous day. I was literally 2.5 feet from Michael Kelly when he was shot. My most vivid memory of Bloody Sunday is just the sound as the bullet hit Michael Kelly and he fell at my feet. And then there was the cover-up that went to the highest level of the British establishment, and including the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, as Christian talked about, who, you know, held a public inquiry but found the innocent guilty and the guilty innocent. And Bloody Sunday killed effectively the non-violent civil rights movement and handed the initiative to the men of violence, and it took 25 years before we could, I suppose, get a peace process properly in place. And I'd like to also acknowledge here that one of the greatest gifts the United States ever gave to Ireland was Senator George Mitchell. If I was going to give the Nobel Peace Prize to anyone related to the Northern Peace process, I would certainly include Senator George Mitchell, a man who showed enormous patience, showed enormous respect to the great players as well as small players, and had time for them all and valued them all, and allowed us to see that, you know, we could actually all gain without there being winners or losers. And just to say thank you to the United States for that gift, and certainly President Clinton is owed a great deal of thanks as well for sending Senator Mitchell to Ireland. I'd like to just tell you some of the stories. Bloody Sunday was one of them, but there were a number of very human stories that really deeply touched me and changed me. You know, I was just thinking tonight of Albert Schweitzer, and one of his great quotations is, "The purpose of human life is to serve and to show compassion and the will to help others." I think that's a really very special insight and a beautiful quotation from Albert Schweitzer. And My story tonight is really a story of compassion and being moved on the road to embrace compassion. I had a neighbour who lived 2 doors down from us in the terrace where we lived in the Craigan Estate, a little street called Leaning Gardens, called Maureen McCann. And Maureen worked in the local swimming pool, public swimming pool. And I can remember many times as a child standing before, she would be the woman who would collect, your clothes and hang the baskets up, and she would give them back to you after you had your swim. And I can remember many times as a kid in the freezing cold, with the little basket in which I had thrown my clothes and top of my scuffed shoes. And she always made me feel special because I was Mrs. Mullan's little boy up the street, so she would always have a very friendly and warm word for me. And one day in the 1970, Maureen left her workplace in the swimming pool, which was on William Street, to walk down to the bottom of William Street towards the main shopping thoroughfare to do some Christmas shopping, when a young official IRA sniper operating from the Roswell Flats, maybe 500-600 yards away, fired at a British Army foot patrol and completely missed them and almost completely severed Maureen's spine. And the woman was propelled into, a torturous agony that lasted maybe 7 years. Her father worked in the local Holy Child Primary School. He was the gardener. He kept the gardens beautiful, manicured, and he had his own little front garden and his own little back garden, which he was looking forward to retiring to. And of course, with Maureen being injured, they dumped literally concrete in the front for a ramp so they could push her wheelchair in and out of the house. And in his back garden, they put bricks and mortar because the houses were too small to put a lift into, so she couldn't go upstairs, so they had to build a bedroom for her. And I'd always remembered Maureen, and when I'd come home from college, I would go to visit her. I remember one day going to visit her, and the thing that really struck me was the smell in the house, just the smell of despair and depression in the house. I'll never forget that. And this was a very proud family and a very clean family. And I remember sitting down at Maureen's bed, and I still remember these throbbing waves of pain going through her, and at times she had to breathe, like a woman giving birth. But I remember at one stage she grabbed my arm and dug her nails into my arm as these waves of pain went through her. And then at one stage she said to me, "Don, I wish I was dead." And who could blame her? And it was so cruel, the suffering that went on for 7 years. And when eventually she died, it was almost too late to have gone through all of that. And I remember thinking to myself, how easy it is, to flex your index finger, but what you unleash on the consequences on another human being are unfathomable. And certainly I saw the consequences of one bullet on the life of a beautiful human being. And Maureen was one of the reasons why I realized I cannot follow this path of violence. I remember as well, I worked as a volunteer in an alcohol and drug abuse rehabilitation centre. Our job as volunteers was to give the daytime staff evenings off and weekends off. And I was on a roster from 5 o'clock on a Saturday evening through to midday Sunday. And my job was, once the residents had gone to bed, just to make sure plugs were pulled out, fires were tidy, and that the place was safe. And then I was able to retire. So I was asleep Sunday morning, and at around 9 o'clock, I was awakened by 4 shots and a scream. And I dressed very quickly and I ran out, and I found a man who had just been assassinated. And I remember he was lying half on, half off the pavement. I still can see the blood pouring out of his head and his chest. But what I especially remember was standing over him was his teenage son and daughter. And they were clasping each other in shocked horror as they looked at the slain body of their father. And I remember as I looked at that moment thinking that violence just doesn't inflict physical wounds. It also inflicts spiritual and historical wounds, because I could imagine that teenage son and daughter in time telling their children what had happened to their grandfather, and how those children would tell their children what had happened to their great-grandfather, and how that act of violence would pulsate and ripple through the generations. And that's what I mean by historical ones. But I also remember thinking, if I was that teenage son and daughter and I saw that done to my father, I would probably spend the rest of my life ensuring the people who did that would never achieve their objectives. So there would be a hardening of the heart and a digging in of the heels and a more vociferous cry of no surrender. And again, that had a very profound effect on me in terms of this is not the way to try and bring about change in life. The man was an off-duty policeman who obviously had been tailed over a number of weeks. His movement's been watched, and he was assassinated by the IRA. Another memory I have was after the British Army came into our areas and took down what were called the no-go areas. The areas were now under the control of the British Army, and the British Army could at times be very vicious. And after Bloody Sunday, we really hated them and resented their presence. And the army one day, and it was during the day, normally they carried out raids at night time, but this was during the day around maybe 5 o'clock in the early evening, came in to raid the home of a Republican family, the Flemings. And they put a ring around, so I was caught inside the ring, so I couldn't throw stones. And the raiding was going on outside the rings. But I remember as I stood watching the raid going on in Fleming's house, there was a British Army Land Rover to my left. I remember standing beside the Land Rover was a soldier who looked very old to me. He was probably just in his 30s, but a little bit pudgy. And I remember he had like a Chinese moustache that spilled over right down to the edge of his jaw. And near me were two teenage girls, and I began to pick on the soldier. And I began to make comments about his moustache. I began to make comments about his belly. I began to make comments about how he looked. And of course, every time I made a comment, the girls laughed, which was boosting my ego. And that encouraged me to continue. And I kept at him and I said really vicious things towards him. And I kept this barrage up maybe for 10 minutes. And then at one stage, one of the girls said, "Jesus, he's crying." And I looked, and the tears were running down the cheeks of this British soldier. And you know, if he had come at me and he'd smacked me, I could have dealt with it. But the fact that I, as a boy, had made a man cry, I didn't know how to deal with it. And I remember I walked away feeling absolutely disgusted with myself. But it didn't end there. I was studying A-level art in a college down in the valley. And I would go there twice a week, and I would take a shortcut home back up into the Craigan, which was on top of a hill, through Brook Park. And at the top of Brook Park, there was a British Army barracks and police station. So as a first line of defence, they had a sanger near a gate. And there was always a sentry in there looking out over the park. So the sentry obviously saw me approaching, and he clearly recognized me. So I took no notice, and I was about to exit through the gate when I heard this English accent, "Hey mate," and I felt resentment because it was a bit like South Africa, where you had to carry identification, a bit like carrying your pass. And so I turned around to face this soldier, preparing to give him my identification, and it was the soldier that I'd made cry. And suddenly my heart started to thump, because he had me in control. I was in his space now. And I didn't know where this was going to go. And he must have held my gaze for maybe all of 5 or 10 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. But I remember he just looked at me and he gave me the most beautiful smile and he waved, clearly telling me to go. But in that moment, without saying a word, I knew what he was saying. And it was, you know, I understand your hatred towards me, and I want you to know I hold no hatred towards you, and I don't want to be here. It was extraordinary, and I didn't stop to try and dialogue with this man. I just wanted to get away. But I remember when I went home, I prayed for that man many nights that he would get home to his family safe. But again, just encountering that humanity was very important in terms of changing me. And my best friend, Shawnee, both of us, we had the dream of becoming professional footballers. I have my boyhood memoir over there called Gordon Banks, a hero who could fly, which tells a lot of these stories. But Gordon Banks was my absolute hero. He was the England goalkeeper. And Shawnee's hero was Pele. And so I was a goalkeeper, Shawnee was an outfield player, and we would spend hours and hours, him shooting, me saving, and so on. And after Bloody Sunday, you know, many of our cohorts were joining the IRA, and there was a lot of pressure on. And I went to Carrickfergus in County Antrim to visit, spend my summer holidays with cousins. And I came back, and we still had the no-go areas at the time, which were under the control of the IRA. And my father picked me up at the train station, and we were driving into the Creggan, and we were stopped by an IRA checkpoint. And I remember looking out, and I could see a young man in denim jeans with a red t-shirt and a mask nursing an old World War I Lee Enfield rifle. And I could see through the mask he was looking at me. And as I looked, I realized that he knew that I knew who he was, and it was my best friend, Shawnee, who had joined the auxiliary IRA. And the last people to know any of this were parents. Never said a word to my father, because if I had said a word to my father, he'd have been up to Shawnee's parents, immediately telling them. Never said a word. And I couldn't wait to leave my suitcase in and get out, and I went straight up and waited for Shawnee to come back. And he told me he had joined the IRA, and he told me that he'd done so because of Bloody Sunday. And I remember saying to him, Shawnee, if you're in, I'm in. And that night he took me to the recruitment officer's house, and we knocked at the door, and the guy wasn't there. And I often think if he had been there, maybe my life would have taken a whole different course. You know, the old saying, but for the grace of God, there go I. But the thought was there. And about a week later, the IRA decided to disband the auxiliaries, and people who were in the auxiliaries were given the option to leave or to become fully fledged members, at which point Shawnee left. So the pressure was off me, and we went back to our dream of becoming professional footballers. And our favourite programmes were, on Saturday night there was, on the BBC, there was Match of the Day, and on Sunday afternoons there was the big match. So one Sunday afternoon, and by this stage the no-go areas had been taken down, so we had a lot of British Army foot patrols and armoured vehicles going around, helicopters and so on. And we were sitting watching the big match when a British Army foot patrol came down Shawnee Street, Circular Road in the Creggan, and they stopped for a breather. And a young British soldier stopped outside the window beside where we were sitting. So literally, like, there was no more distance between me and this, just a wall and a window between. But the soldier wasn't interested about what was happening inside the house. He was watching for snipers. And Shawnee and I fell into silence, and we looked at him. And then Shawnee spoke a question that was life-changing. And he said, Don, when you see him as a human being, how could you kill him? It was an extraordinary question from, you know, Shawnee would have been 17, I was 16 at the time. And suddenly I saw the human being behind the uniform. And I saw the furrowed brow, and I could see the sweat beads, and I could see the fear in his eyes, and I saw the human being. And again, that had a very profound impact on me. And Shawnee often said to me, Shawnee was killed at the age of 21 in a car crash, and I still miss him, actually. You know, he was my soulmate. Still miss him. But I always remember Shawnee saying to me that he thought the most beautiful word in the English language was compassion. And it really is. It's the most beautiful word. And even to see how much Albert Schweitzer talks about compassion is just really beautiful in his quotations. And I realized Shawnee didn't have it in him to pursue the path of violence. And I realized, of course, there are great injustices in the world, and they must be confronted. We can't turn a blind eye on them. Desmond Tutu says, you know, that if there's an injustice and you sit on the fence, then you've sided with the oppressor. There is no middle ground. You know, you're either for justice or you're against it. We have to be for justice. And I realized that I needed to find a methodology. And I began to look around the world, and people like Mother Teresa had a huge impact on me. And I became friends with the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, Arun Gandhi. I lived in Brazil in the diocese of a very famous peacemaker called Dom Helder Câmara. The new Pope, Pope Francis impressed many people about his simplicity and his humility. Well, Don Helder was doing what he's doing now 40 years ago. Extraordinary man who was persona non grata after the Brazilian coup d'etat and was the voice of the voiceless. You might remember his quote, "When I give food to the hungry, they call me a saint. When I asked why are they hungry, they call me a communist." Well, that was Don Helder. And I had the great privilege of living and working in his diocese and getting to know him. And then, of course, there was Desmond Tutu, whose friendship I still enjoy to this day. He's like a father to me, and there are times he has admonished me like a father as well when he's not happy with things that I've done. So it's just an interesting experience. So all of those people, had huge influences on me, and all of this molding, in a sense, has led me to this journey where I feel the importance of embracing the 100th anniversary of World War I and finding a way where it's not about the glorification of war, but trying to learn lessons of humanity and trying to create a life-giving memorial. And since it's about the First World War, and I felt very confirmed today when I was reading the quotations of Albert Schweitzer about this. I just want to take you on a journey, first of all. And think of our planet. It's a jewel of the universe. And think of the arrogance that Galileo had to cope with in terms of, lofty church officials 400 years ago when he dared to suggest that the earth wasn't the center of the universe, it was the sun. And he ended up as a prisoner in his own house because he challenged the orthodoxy at the time. And of course now we know that he was right and he was wrong, because our sun is not the center of the universe. Our sun's a minor star at the age of a minor galaxy. And if we were in a position where we could take a spacecraft and travel to the end of our solar system and look back, our Earth would have disappeared from the naked eye. And then you realize our galaxy, is one of billions of galaxies. And that within those galaxies, there are other solar systems with trillions of planets. And it's more probable than improbable mathematically that there is other life forms out there, but we don't know. As of now, the Earth is the only known life giver in the universe, and we bring to it the great gift of consciousness. And I think when you realize that, and you realize that we literally survive on a moisturized speck of dust in the cosmos, it has to be very humbling. And education should always be a process that's leading us towards humility. It should teach us, that there are more questions than answers. So the idea of academic arrogance, and I unapologetically say this as well in education institutions, sometimes the small-mindedness between academics, trying to prove that they're more intelligent or more knowledgeable than others. And they get caught up in this. And intellectual arrogance really is a revelation of great ignorance. And I think education must teach us how little we know, not how much we know. And we really need, if this world is to survive, to come to a realization, that gentleness and humility have to be, the primary motivating factors that bring us forward. The idea that any world religion can contain the whole truth. The idea of fundamentalism is a huge heresy, and particularly violent fundamentalism has to be opposed and has to be stopped. But it is a huge arrogance that anyone can think that our religion is the one true religion. Because, again, when you think of it in terms of that moisturized speck of dust, in a cosmos, a known cosmos, which is at least 40 billion light years across, it just doesn't make sense. So the idea of any human being lording it over another human being because of their color or their culture or where they live or their sexual orientation, or even the horrendous violence against women, and even the language. I mean, it was interesting in terms of Albert Schweitzer as well. I mean, I think that he would, if he was alive today, he would change his language because he talks about man. And I think that type of language as well, from the Bible and from the use of it, needs to be changed as well, because the idea that males are dominant over women, is just appalling. And Frederick Douglass writes about this as well very beautifully. I mean, how we've almost incapacitated, through that prejudice, half the human race. The idea that 240 young women could be stolen and disappear in Nigeria simply because fundamentalists want to say that girls shouldn't be educated is appalling, So there's a lot that we have to do, and we have to be brave and be prepared to challenge it. And we've got to stop a lot of that fundamentalism, but we also have to develop, I think, a spirit of gentleness and of humility. And I think that begins in great universities as well. So, how did I end up getting interested in the First World War? Irish nationalists and from the Catholic tradition who went to fight with the British Army during the First World War returned to an Ireland, those who survived, that was in turmoil, to an Ireland that revolutionaries had used the First World War with the slogan, Britain's crisis is Ireland's opportunity, and so they had a rising in 1916, which the British quite viciously quelled. And then there was the War of Independence, followed by a civil war. So many of those men who were very traumatized from the Catholic and nationalist tradition literally come home, and apart from those who had gone through the experience with them, they'd no one to listen to their stories or to know of the torment that they actually had gone through, because they had been through hell on earth. In the Protestant tradition in the North, it was very different. They were greeted like heroes and were celebrated. And I suffered from that as well, because I had no interest in the First World War. Until a man called Gary Burke was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He was my wife's godfather, and he was anxious that his father's story and his father's war medals would be given to someone who would take care of them, and he gave me his father's war medals. But amongst them was a crucifix, which I should have brought. I forgot to bring it. I was kicking myself when I realized I'd come away without having brought it. But this crucifix was given to him by his mother before he went to the front. And when you see the crucifix, the body of Christ is worn down. It's like a worry stone. You can imagine him in the trenches, just probably as shells were coming over, and they went through some horrendous bombardments, including he was there when the Germans, they launched the spring offensive on the 21st of March 1918 to try and end the war before the Americans really got involved. And at that spring offensive, he was hit and seriously wounded by a German sniper, but the bullet hit the cross and was deflected over his heart, and you can still see the bullet mark on the left arm of the cross. But Gary told me that his father always maintained that his life was saved by a young German officer who found him, and he wouldn't leave him to die. And he picked him up and he carried him to a field hospital so that he could be saved. And all through his life, he always maintained that this young German officer saved his life. And again, that moment of humanity was really, really important. And then my book, when it came out, it was the front cover story of the London Times magazine. And I was contacted by a group called Truce, who they took their inspiration from a game of football that happened during the First World War, and they asked, would I mind if they put my book up on their website, because the spirit of it and what they were about kind of mirrored what they were trying to do. And of course I said, no, it's fine, but that got me interested in the truce, and I began to think. But then something very strange happened to me. I was visiting Barcelona in 2008, and I'd gone through a very difficult time. I'd lost a lot of money on an event that I'd organized. I was too trusting, and it was really a difficult time. But I managed to get 5 cheap flights on Ryanair, if anybody knows them. They're not the most popular in Europe, but they certainly are used a lot. And I found a cheap hospital. It was just nice to be together and to have the sunshine away from the doldrums of an Irish summer sometimes, which can not be the most pleasant. And our eldest daughter, Trey, said, Dad, there's a tram, it's not very expensive, which takes you up into the hills around Barcelona. There's beautiful views of the city and of the Mediterranean. So I said, yeah, let's do that. So we found the tram and up we went. And at the top of it, there was a basilica that was built by a Catholic saint called Don Bosco, whom I'm named after. My name is Don Bosco. And when I went inside, there was a Blessed Sacrament chapel that a priest told me there had been adoration there since 1966. And of course, that is a very important date for me, because that was the year of the England World Cup, and when I found Gordon Banks my great hero. So that resonated. And before we went home, I said to my family, look, I'd really like to go up there and I'd like to spend an hour just on my own quietly in the chapel. So we went up there and I went into the chapel. And I can't explain it, and please understand, I didn't hear voices. Okay? But it was like I heard an intuitive command. And I can't explain it to this day, but it was so clear, and it was, go to Flanders and find the field. It was as clear as that, go to Flanders and find the field. And I knew it was about the field where the game of football took place. And within 3 weeks, that was the 9th of August, and I always remember because that's the anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. And I was there on the 28th of August. And when I got there, I found books on the Christmas Truce, which I began to read. And suddenly I realized this is much bigger and far more important than just the game of football. And just to tell you, the Pope at the time, Benedict XV, he had actually called for a truce during the first Christmas, and the Germans said, okay, we'll agree if the British and the French agree, but the British and the French didn't agree. So the Pope lamented, that our little project has failed. And I look back now 100 years later and I say, thank God it failed, because if the generals had agreed a truce, it would have been just a footnote in history today. Because what happened was an absolute miracle. And it was completely spontaneous from ordinary soldiers and low-ranking officers. And there are many, many stories. And remember, the front line went from the North Sea down to the Swiss border. So it was about, I think, 347 miles. And the truce happened about 2/3 of the way along it. So what I'm telling you are little vignettes that happened all over the place, okay? And in one place, there's a story told of soldiers, British soldiers, being stunned into silence by this beautiful singing coming from the German trenches. And of course, Christmas Eve is in Germany the big celebration, whereas in Ireland and Britain, the United States, it would be Christmas Day for Christians. But in Germany, for some reason, it's Christmas Eve. So the Germans, of course, were celebrating Christmas on Christmas Eve. And to make the soldiers feel at home, literally thousands of little Christmas trees were sent on trains, and even the generals were complaining, saying, we need ammunition, not Christmas trees sent. But anyway, these trees were sent, small little trees with clamps and with candles. And they lit the candles on the clamps, and of course, where were they going to put them? In crowded trenches. So in most cases, the trees were put on top. And you have beautiful stories written by British soldiers saying, we saw these lights and they were beautiful, but we didn't know what they were. And one soldier describes them like the lights in front of a theatre. And anyway, in this area, the soldiers were stunned into silence with these beautiful singing voices. And when the voices tapered out, the British soldiers spontaneously broke into applause and began to cheer. And then they sang back. So curiosity began to rise in the trenches, and kind of heads began to appear, and then chests and full bodies appeared on top, and no one was shooting, and they edged towards each other, and they agreed a truce the next day. And the next morning they met. They had joint religious services. They helped to bury their dead. They shared tea and coffee, wine, cognac, beer. Chocolates had been sent out, puddings had been sent out from home, bully beef and so on. They showed photographs of their loved ones. They stood together to have photographs taken. And some of the soldiers, German soldiers, could speak good English because they had been taxi drivers or worked in hotels in London. And in some cases, one soldier asked a British soldier to send a letter back to his girlfriend in England. And in the afternoon, they not just played one game of football, they played several games of football. And I just recently came across a story where 2 bicycles without tires were found in a barn house, and they brought those out and they had races with the bicycles. And you can imagine in terms of the games that they played as well. In some cases you had maybe scores or sometimes 200 young men running up and down, kicking a ball in no man's land. And there's a strong tradition that there was a regulation game of football or game of soccer played 11 aside, where they just simply put down their caps. And the problem is we don't have anybody who says, I saw the game or I played in the game. But we do have 3 reports, contemporary reports, from regimental diaries from both sides who claim that the game took place, and all 3 give the same result, 3-2 to the Germans. So that's quite convincing in a sense. So you can think of that in terms of, there's a beautiful story as well told of a German who he had his violin with him, and he stood on top of the trenches and he played a beautiful piece of music from Handel. So you put all of that together and suddenly you realize this is extraordinary material for an amazing cultural program and commemoration. And I felt more and more moved to try and do something special, because the world knows about the Christmas Truce, but they've nowhere to go. And I began to look at where could I develop this project, that would involve football, that would involve culture, music, and so on. And I kept coming back to the smallest town in Belgium called Mazines. It's a very important town because the Irish, the Catholics and Protestants, the 36th Ulster and the 16th Irish Divisions, along with the Anzacs, helped to liberate it in June 1917. And there is a wonderful Island of Ireland Peace Park there, one of the great memorials of the First World War in Flanders. But I didn't go there because of the Irish connection, but I kept being called back to it. And one of the stories I discovered was there was a young German soldier in Mazines at the time of the Christmas Truce. And he refused to take part because he considered it dishonourable. And if I was making this up as a piece of fiction, you would say it's too far-fetched. But he was billeted behind the lines in a farmhouse called Bethlehem Farm, which still exists to this day. He was injured, some say, from the effects of gas, and he recovered in the crypt of St. Nicholas Church, which is still intact today, in a German field hospital. And he was a very good watercolour painter, and during a lull in the fighting, he painted the ruins of St. Nicholas Church, the original of which still exists today. And during the Second World War, he returned to Mazines to recall his experience during the First World War. His name, Adolf Hitler. And I thought, this is the place that I have got to build, the city of the Christmas Truce. This is the place, because what we've got to do here is create a place that welcomes all people, of all religions, of all backgrounds, of all orientations. You know, a place of justice and peace, a place where people can come to be rejuvenated and renewed, where youth can be inspired. And so I began to work with the local city, with the mayor, with the parish of St. Nicholas, and there is actually also a world-class youth hostel already there because of the Irish peace process the Flemish government had actually built at the cost of 6.5 million. And when I would go over the last 5 years, often I would be the only person staying at the Peace Village, and it was in danger of becoming a white elephant, and yet this was the primary piece of infrastructure that was needed, and it was already there in existence. So we've now created the Flanders Peace Field. And I always, when I saw the vision of it, I always thought of it as like an American football field, a college football field that is, you know, with the bleachers around, not a big stadium, just somewhere where young people could come. And that there would be a whole education process around it. And I've managed to get UNESCO involved, I've managed to get the United Nations Office on Sport for Development and Peace behind it. And the aim is to bring young people from all over Europe, conflict areas of the world, where they go through education modules. And the highlight will be to play on the Flanders Peace Field. And they will all be given then a peace medal, a Flanders Peace Medal, Peace Field Medal, and a certificate. And we'll go back hopefully as young budding peacemakers. And in fact, I've talked to UNESCO, and we're actually looking at the ways of maybe creating young UNESCO ambassadors coming out of the Flanders Peace Field. We're looking also in terms of St. Nicholas Church. Desmond Tutu is to lead a multi-faith gathering on the 6th of December this year. And the legacy we want to come out of that is that the crypt where Hitler recovered in is going to be turned into a multi-faith space, like a meditation place where people can come to pray or to meditate or just be silent in memory of the Christmas Truce. The plan also is that we would create cultural events. I mean, we've already had wonderful concerts, and I'm creating satellite concerts around the world. So, for example, if Quinnipiac has a choir, maybe they could consider this year, before the end of this term, putting on a Christmas Truce choir, and I have a template that they can use, which includes carols and songs that were sung and we have recorded from the Christmas Truce of 1914. One of the beautiful songs, actually, that they sang was a song that was sung during the American Civil War, Home Sweet Home. And the Union Army actually banned it from being played because there was one occasion, I think it was down around Delaware, where the two armies were on either side of the river, and the Confederate Army began to play Home Sweet Home, and the Union soldiers stood up and their band began to play in harmony, Home Sweet Home, and the soldiers moved towards the river. Sorry. And it was an extraordinary moment where they recognized their common humanity and they waved and cheered towards each other. And it was a song that was too soft for the general, so they banned it. It was extraordinary. And let me read you some of the quotations from soldiers who took part. Part of the concert we do is called Voices of the Christmas Truce. And it's when you read the stories of the soldiers, because the propaganda had led them to believe that they were fighting monsters on the other side. And when they met each other on Christmas morning, they realized, we're just human beings. And some of the beautiful little comments in the letters are throwaway comments, like, he was actually a very nice man. They're surprised to find that they're dealing with other human beings. So, a young British soldier, Albert Mullan, near La Chapelle, only about 10 kilometres from Mazines, he recalled, "It was a beautiful moonlight night, frost on the ground, white almost everywhere. And there was a lot of commotion in the German trenches. And then there were those lights. I don't know what they were. And then they sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night. I shall never forget it. It was one of the highlights of my life." In the Dublin Evening Herald, on the 4th of January 1915, they published the following account from a Belgian soldier about the truth. He said, "At midnight, a baritone stood up and in a rich, resonant voice began to sing. The cannonade ceased, and then, when he finished, applause broke out from our side and from the German trenches. At dawn, the Germans displayed a placard over the trenches on which was written, 'Happy Christmas.' Then, leaving their trenches, unarmed, they advanced towards us singing and shouting, 'Comrades.' No one fired." And just in the last 2 weeks, a man I met in Dublin, he sent me a cutting from a Scottish newspaper about his grandfather. And it was the letter that he'd sent to his wife about the Christmas Truce. And it was amazing, this professor from Edinburgh University, and it was his grandfather who actually wrote this. It's a long letter, I'm not going to read it all, but he talks about, "I was greeted with outstretched hands, and the German said in broken English, 'English comrade.' I then said, 'War finish?' He replied, 'Oh no, 3 days.' I said, 'No, finish. I pack up and go to England, you pack up and go to Germany.' But he replied, as before, 3 days. While this was going on, the dead body of a Frenchman was observed lying close by. Shovels were sent for, and the Seaforth Highlanders and Germans took turnabout of digging the grave. When all was ready, 2 Seaforths took the head and 2 Germans the feet, and the Frenchman was laid to his last resting place. When the grave had been filled in, 2 candles were lighted and placed on top, along with the deceased's cap. Then a German Red Cross man conducted a short service, while both sides stood with heads uncovered. The scene was one I can never forget. Afterwards, both sides returned to their trenches. This lasted for roughly 20 minutes, and as they said, no firing took place for 3 days." So there are many, many voices of the Christmas Truce, and it's really very special. I want to finish with a Tennessee Williams quotation. And what really gripped me about this particular quotation was when I heard it performed in Dublin. It reminded me of the many military cemeteries I've visited over the last 6 years throughout Flanders and throughout Germany, where you literally have hundreds of young men from Ireland, from England, from Wales, from Scotland, from Germany, from France, from Belgium, from the United States, from Canada, from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, from Algeria, from Turkey, and so on, who lie there. I always try to make a point when I go there to at least walk through one of the graveyards. And I try to take time to read the names and any little inscriptions and the ages. And most of them are 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, like the age of students here, And a lot of them are unknown. And it's a very moving little quotation, like known unto God. And you think of who's lying there, who was his mother and father, who were his brothers and sisters, not knowing whatever became of him. You know, he never came home. And it's really, really moving. And I keep thinking, and I pray to them and I say, what is it that you want? You know, why am I moved to do this? And I got the answer. My daughter, she graduated in dramatic performance from a college, a conservatory in Dublin. And she was the youngest in the class, and they decided to do the Tennessee Williams play Orpheus Descending. And she was given the part of Lady, which was the main part. But the part that really caught my imagination was Carol Cotray, who was a rich young white woman who used her money to try and help black people to get education and so on. And she was ostracized from her community when she protested the conviction of a black man for the rape of a white woman, which she knew he hadn't done. And in the play, she tells how she marched on the state capitol in support of this black man. This is 10 years before the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, Tennessee Williams was an absolute genius. And he was writing these things 10 years before even the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s. And so anyway, she meets Valentine, who is a wandering singer. So she's on the margins of her community. She's considered to be a little bit mad. And he's an outsider. He's no prejudice towards her, so they're talking. And she says to him, "Take me out to Cypress Hill in my car, to the graveyard, and I let you hear the dead people talk. They do talk there. They chatter together like birds on Cypress Hill, but all they say is one word, and that one word is live. They say, live, 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 live. It's all they've learned. It's the only advice they can give. Just live. Simple. A very simple instruction." Thank you very much.
I know you'll agree that was fantastic, a very emotional, personal journey. I know time's running, but maybe 2 questions, if anybody has a question for Don.
Do you know the Garth Brooks song about?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. The 5 concerts that were to be played at Croke Park, and I was actually, in my mind, I was thinking, I'm going to ask them to make a contribution to the city of the Christmas Truce. And, you know, what's really interesting is the United States weren't involved in the war at that time, but there's been a huge mushrooming of interest. Like you've got the Gareth Brooks song, for example. There is a guy called McCutcheon who has written a beautiful song, you'll get it on YouTube, called Christmas in the Trenches. And he's developed that song now, which became and one of the things that I really loved, he said that he used to think he would only sing it at Christmas. But anywhere he would go to give concerts, people always asked it, and he realized, no, this is appropriate, any season to sing the song. And he's developed it into a children's book called Christmas in the Trenches, as if it's a grandfather telling the story to his grandchild. But what's really interesting is that in that, his introduction, he tells how he came to learn about the Christmas Truce. And he said he was giving a concert in Memphis, and it was a backstage janitor who told him about the Christmas Truce. So it might have been a poor black woman in Tennessee who told him about the Christmas Truce, and that's what gave birth to that beautiful song. There's been 3 illustrated books that are now in the United States about the Christmas Truce. I just recently learned, the next university I'm going to is Penn State at the weekend, and there was one of the books I mentioned. I got 2 books, and one of the books is called Silent Night: The Story of the Christmas Truce. And it was actually written by a Penn State alumni. An old man now who's retired, but I'm hoping to make contact with him, and I'm hoping we might be able to get his papers as well, because I'm sure he's some amazing stuff within it. And then, of course, there was the French film Joyeux Noël, which is a beautiful film about the Christmas Truce, if you can get your hands on it. But that inspired a Pulitzer Prize-winning musical in the United States. The guy comes from near, I think it's Yonkers, he lives, the guy who wrote it, but he wrote it for Minnesota, and it's performed every year in Minnesota. And then the Mormons, the famous Mormon Tabernacle Choir, in 2006, they put on a wonderful Christmas concert around the Christmas Truce, narrated by the late Walter Cronkite, and 85,000 people came to that. And in fact, I've got the Mormons involved as well. In fact, a wonderful Mormon artist called Robert T. Barrett, he's one of America's best illustrators. He has illustrated a book called Silent Night, Holy Night about the Christmas Truce, and he has donated the originals of that book for Mazines. And in fact, I have a Mormon professor coming to Penn State at the weekend to talk to me about maybe doing some film work as well around it, you know. So it's extraordinary. There's great interest in the United States around it, yeah. But I'd love to, if Gareth Brooks was on, he's still on my radar, you know. So, any more questions? Yeah.
I'm curious to know what you think the central experiences that formed the men on both sides, or what are the central experiences that formed the men on both sides that led to that moment? And what is things like this don't just come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
They have some background, just like you told us our story.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good question, and I think it's a very simple answer. When they were going to war, both sides thought it was going to be over by Christmas. And when they went, you know, there's parades, you know, down the streets, and they're greeted as great heroes, and there's photographs of children carrying their father's weapons as they're walking to the railway stations and so on. And this is happening in Germany, it's happening in France, it's happening in Britain and so on. And then it becomes clear, you know, this is not going to be over, and the trenches are dug, and you know, it's the sadness. Like, it's as one Irish poet talked about, you know, the war was for a few feet of liquid mud, because it just moved back and forth, maybe 40 miles. You know, the line moved back and forth through those 4 years, and 16 million people, you know, young men killed mainly, you know. And I think they were tired. I think they just wanted to go home. I think there was huge nostalgia. I think it was exactly the same thing that happened to those soldiers during the Civil War, American Civil War, when the Confederate band started to play Home Sweet Home, and the Union band joined in, and the soldiers just naturally moved towards the river and began to shout towards each other. And I think maybe there's a recognition as well, they were just cannon fodder, you know, and they were caught in the vortex of violence. I don't know if anyone has seen War Horse, the movie, you know, but there's an extraordinary moment where the whistle blows and the young men have to go over the line, and you know, you can see kind of almost this lethal lead coming over the heads, and there's one young man, he gets violently sick and he can't do it, and an officer comes up to him and cocks his gun and he says, "If you don't go over, I'll shoot you myself." And in some ways that was the trap that they were found in, you know. So I think a little moment of relief, and the generals, of course, didn't want it to happen, you know. And I think part of the success, many cynics say, and they went back to killing each other the next day. In fact, that's not true. It was really when those soldiers were taken away, new soldiers come in who didn't have the experience, that it happened. Because when you encounter the humanity of your enemy, it's very hard to kill them. It's very hard to kill them, you know. And one story, to me again, which is one of the great seeds that has come out of the Christmas Truce, of the 1915 Christmas Truce, would you believe that there is a wonderful youth movement today that came out of it? And there was a German soldier called Richard Schirman, and he records how when the Christmas bells were heard ringing on Christmas morning in the churches behind the lines, he said something fantastically unmilitary happened. He said soldiers began to make contact with each other through disused tunnels, and they agreed a truce. This was French and German soldiers. And he said they exchanged wine and cognac and black Westphalian bread, and they agreed a truce, and he said it went on for several weeks. But the experience caused Shearman to ponder the desirability of creating opportunities for thoughtful young people of all nations to come together and get to know each other in a respectful manner. And in 1919, he founded the German Youth Hosteling Association. And in 1932, he founded the International Youth Hosteling Association. In 1933, he became the president of it. And in 1936, the Nazis forced him to resign because they didn't like it. Okay? But the International Youth Hosteling Association is now called Hosteling International. It's the 6th biggest provider of accommodation for travellers in the world every year. And since the end of the Second World War, it's provided 1.6 billion beds for young travellers. It's incredible. And that came out of the Christmas Truce. In fact, let me finish with this, right? This is what Shearman wrote, and I just want to then finish with the mission statement of Hosteling International, just to show how that truce still is influencing the world today. He talked about, he wondered whether thoughtful young people of all countries could be provided with suitable meeting places where they could get to know each other, okay? And Hosteling International, which he is the founder of, defines its mission as to promote the education of all young people of all nations, but especially young people of limited means, by encouraging in them a greater knowledge, love and care of the countryside, and an appreciation of the cultural values of towns and cities in all parts of the world, and as ancillary thereto, to provide hostels or other accommodation in which there shall be no discrimination of race, nationality, colour, religion, sex, class, or political opinions, and thereby to develop a better understanding of their fellow men and women, both at home and abroad. Isn't that beautiful? And that came out of the 1915 Christmas Truce, and people don't realise it. I'm sorry, Christine. Sorry for going on. Okay.
We are out of time, so thank you all, everybody, for coming. Thanks, Sarah and Joe, who really pulled this event together. You did a great job. Paul, thank you for your gracious introduction to Dan. David, yes, I hope this is the start of many collaborations. I think it will be. But mostly thank you to Dan Mullan, and I think he truly has left us with hope. So thank you, Dan.